is a veteran lawyer, author, and a former communications aide to the President of the United States. More importantly, he is a proud son of the Mississippi Delta. Growing up in poverty for much of his childhood, Pinkins picked cotton throughout his teenage years to help his parents make ends meet. Therefore, he knows deeply and intimately the struggles of many Mississippians. After graduating from one of Mississippi's underfunded and under-resourced public schools, he too experienced the joy and supportive environment of Mississippi's esteemed HBCUs by enrolling at Tougaloo College. While he loved Tougaloo and what it offered academically, culturally, and socially, like so many of our students, Ty found the financial struggles to be more than he or his family could bear. So he joined the Army. During his 21 years of service, in which he served 3 combat tours in Iraq and was awarded numerous medals, including the Bronze Star, Ty earned his bachelor's degree in political science from the University of Maryland Global Campus. In the final 3 years of his military career, he was selected to serve in the White House Communications Agency, working for both President Obama and Trump to provide their communication needs. While on active duty, Ty founded a nonprofit youth organization, the Pyramid Project, to mentor and support students in the Mississippi Delta, and to bring them to Washington, and even into the White House itself. Upon retirement from the Army, Ty was accepted at the Georgetown University Law Center, where he earned his JD and LLM in National Security Law. After graduating from law school, he was greeted with opportunities to work for some of Mississippi's most prestigious law firms. However, his passion was so strong, he took a position with the Mississippi Center for Justice, fighting to protect the rights and livelihoods of people who were vulnerable to the predations and the rich and powerful, landowners, landlords, and business interests. In both his military and legal careers, he has been in the room with some of the most powerful people in our country, his state, and the region. Today, Ty is a candidate for the U.S. Senate, seeking to represent the people of the state of Mississippi, and such as he is committed to seeing that all Mississippians have access to affordable and readily available health care. He is pledged fairly to supporting our public education system, a system that was so vital to him and his schoolmates. Ty is entirely dedicated to preserving and supporting our HBCUs, many of which are state schools, as they carry out their sacred mission to provide our students with a quality education equal to anywhere. He is passionate about bringing well-paying and personally satisfying jobs to our communities, particularly the Delta, which has been intentionally starved of investment and opportunity. As a proud son of the Mississippi Delta, Ty continues to advocate on behalf of the people in some of Mississippi's most underserved communities. He is the author of 23 Miles in Warning, My American Journey from Chopping Cotton in Mississippi Delta to the Sleeping in the White House, which recounts the honest and compelling stories of Ty's struggles to overcome early setbacks and difficulties, his determination to serve his country honorably and bravely while furthering his education, his fascinating experience working under America's first Black president, and his dedication to earning a law degree from one of the country's most well-regarded law schools, so that he could come back to Mississippi and stand up for the fair treatment for our state's workers being preyed upon by the rich and powerful. It is my honor to introduce to you Ty Pinkins.
Thank you, Ms. Burns, for that warm introduction. Give her another round of applause, because that was absolutely amazing. Your president tried to warn me when I sat down. And I'm going to tell you what he said. He said, "We have an amazing choir, brace yourself." I've been to black churches before. I have. I grew up in a black church. But I leaned over when they were singing and I said, wow. So another round of applause for y'all. You are so beautiful. Your voices, Thank you. Dr. Briggs, faculty, staff, students, distinguished guests, and community members, thank you for inviting me to speak today. Whenever I step foot on our HBCU campuses, I always feel at home. But that introduction from Ms. Burns made me feel loved. Thank you so much for that. I appreciate it. My name is Ty Pinkins. I'm a veteran, a lawyer, and a former communications aide to the President of the United States. But more important than all of that, I'm a proud son of the Mississippi Delta. To all the Mississippi Valley State University family, it is an honor to be here with you today on this momentous occasion in Itta Bena, Mississippi, a place that holds such deep significance in the history of our nation's struggle for civil rights and equality. We are here today to celebrate the legacy of those who came before us, to honor their sacrifices, and to remember the struggles that have brought us to this point. Driving here today, I thought about something that happened to me way back a long time ago. One Saturday morning, wearing a pair of big old brown glasses, I was about 10 years old. I hopped into my dad's old beat-up pickup truck. We drove to town, to the public high school. Then, as it is now, Rolling Fork had and has two schools. The white kids attended private Sharkey Issaquena Academy. Rolling Fork Elementary and Rolling Fork High was public and mostly black. Ironically, many of the white teachers at the black school sent their children over to the academy. Something that, like many things, hasn't changed much in all this time. That hot summer Saturday, we parked outside the school gym. I followed Dad across the potholed parking lot. He yanked open a stuck heavy metal door. Inside, dusty glass windows lined the wall of the gym. Birds were flying around in the ceiling above. They'd gotten in through some of the broken window panes. I saw kids dressed in white martial arts uniforms. While Dad spoke to a big, burly black man, I marveled at the kids as they yelled, kicked, rolled, and jumped. Ty, Dad tapped me on my shoulder. I want you to meet someone. This is Mr. Duckworth, and he's going to be your sensei. A military vet, Sensei Duckworth was a second-degree black belt who taught Taekwondo to community kids. Sensei stood towering right in front of me. The very first words he said to me were, "Hit me." Yeah, that's what he said. And guess what I said? What? My heart quickened as I thought to myself, you're big as a house and full of muscles. I don't even know you. And you want me to hit you? No thanks, buddy. Again, he demanded firmly, hit me right here. He jabbed his index finger into his stomach. I desperately wanted to hide my puny body behind my dad. And you'd have to excuse me, I get emotional when I talk about my dad. So I'll pause every now and then when I say his name. But I pushed those big old brown glasses up the bridge of my nose. I reared back, and I threw a right-handed punch that bounced harmlessly off his rock-hard abs. Out of nowhere, with what sounded like a scream from the far reaches of Asia, he punched me in my chest. And I said, ooh. Some of y'all know how that feels. I found myself on my back, sliding across that dusty gym floor, glasses going every which way. Lying on my back, I stared up at the birds. It seemed like they were laughing at me. I struggled to my feet, fixed my glasses, and stood behind Dad as they shook hands. Bring them back Monday after school, Sensei said. Wait, what? Bring who back after school? Bring who back after school? The voice in my head asked frantically. Dad and I left the gym, and as usual, he didn't say much on the ride home. Then he broke the silence. Above the roar of the truck's engine, he asked, "You want to come back on Monday and start Taekwondo lessons?" I don't know if I was more afraid of disappointing Dad by saying no, or that Sensei Duckworth was going to beat the crap out of me on Monday after school. I could see in Dad's eyes that he cared deeply about me and wouldn't put me in the care of a killer. So I said meekly, yes. He smiled and nodded in approval. The only other sound was that truck's engine as we moved down the highway. To my surprise, I quickly grew to enjoy martial arts training. About a year later, Dad dropped me off again, but this time he didn't stay. It was a Saturday morning. I was scheduled that day to test for belt advancement. When I entered the gym, Sensei Duckworth instructed me to move to the middle of that dusty basketball court. Face away from him, stare at the wall, and don't say a word. My ears tuned to the sound of those birds. My mind focused on the particles of dust floating in the sunlight. Now, I don't remember what color my belt was that day. However, what I do remember is Sensei Duckworth walking up behind me, tapping me on my shoulder, and ordering me to turn and face him. Before I could fully turn around, two things happened. First, to my horror, I realized that there were now two additional black belted men standing before me. 2 plus 1. It's 3 of them now. One was slim, a red-headed white guy, lightning quick. The other was as big as Sensei Duckworth himself, at least 200 pounds. The second thing I noticed was a familiar scream and a solid punch as Sensei Duckworth nailed me with his right hand. The two others joined in. I'd grown some in a year, but I was still as light as a feather. Every time I kicked, one of them would whack me in the jaw. When I spun around to confront the sucker puncher, I'd get kicked in the ribs by someone else. I realized in that moment that they were going to make me earn that belt. They were going to make me earn it. I had to do that by enduring what they threw at me and resisting the best I could. It was like fighting ghosts. I was punched, kicked, knocked down, and dragged all across that dusty gym floor. Everything became a blur. Then I got whacked in the jaw and knocked off my feet. Everything moved in slow motion. My ears rang like a giant church bell was inside my head. I landed on the floor. My glasses flew off. I couldn't see because the world went out of focus. I felt like those birds were circling my head, tweeting, like in the cartoons. Bruised, sweating, and breathing heavily, I was about to start crying. And I wanted to quit. As the ringing slowly dissipated, I could hear the heavy breathing and shuffling feet of those 3 assailants behind me, just waiting for me to stand up so they could pound on me some more. As I lay there on the floor trying to catch my breath, I pushed my glasses back up on the bridge of my nose. Vision restored, I noticed something. There were 2 concrete pillars running from the floor to the ceiling, 2 of them. There was a gap between the 2 pillars. And in that gap between those pillars was a small, dusty window. Someone had wiped the dirt away from one of those dirty windows. I looked closer, and it was Dad, standing in that gap, behind that dusty window pane. His eyes locked with mine. I read his lips. Get up. He was saying, get up. I staggered to my feet, and I fought back, and I got knocked back down, and I got back up, and I got knocked back down, but I kept fighting. I knew Dad was still standing there, in that gap, watching over me, on the other side of that window. He trusted Sensei, a respected member in our community, to push me to my limits. But he was giving me space to learn and to prove that I could endure everything they threw at me, and that I could persevere by fighting back the best I could. Back then, I could hear his voice in my head, and even today, when I face a challenge, I can still hear his voice in my head saying, get up, finish the fight. That voice has given me strength to carry on through some fights that were literally life and death in war. Now, what's that got to do with what I have to say to you today? Well, the theme of our convocation is Black resistance. And I want to mention 2 components that have always been integral to that resistance. Standing in the gap, as my father did for me, literally, and the righteous no. Standing in the gap and the righteous no. And there are 3 forms of energy that have powered those 2 components and our resistance. Endurance, which is the static and positive form. Perseverance, which is the active doing form. And love, which is the embracing, sustaining form. Endurance, that's the lasting, resistive energy that says, you can enslave us, you can beat us, you can hang us from trees, you can keep us from voting, you can act like we are not even real human beings, you can throw us in jail, you can turn dogs, fire hoses, and guns on us, and we will still be here, facing you down, fighting back every day. Throughout our history, our people have had to face all those things, and we have endured. Perseverance. Perseverance is a resistive energy that works like friction to wear away at gaps and obstacles, to smooth them down and level them up. It's the energy that says not only will we endure, we will make a better world for us, for our children, and for you too. And finally, there's love, which at times has been the only thing available to our communities to keep enduring and persevering. That love not only embraces our own people and our own children, but it's a remarkable fact in our history that not only have we not sought revenge for all the injustices I mentioned earlier, we have, as Dr. King made clear, instead offered the same powerful love to those who have oppressed us. Because we've lived through oppression and injustice, we know in our hearts that injustice anywhere truly is a threat to justice everywhere. And to justice for all people. Now, what do I mean by the gap? What do I mean by that gap? That gap that my dad stood in. And what does it mean to stand in the gap? A gap is anything that keeps us from being the person we are capable of being. A gap is anything that keeps us from being the person we are capable of being. It is a lack of something vital to us being fully all that we can be and achieving the potential with which we have been blessed. It could be something that comes from within us, or which is imposed on us from outside. It could be a lack of love, a lack of money, a lack of food, a lack of confidence or feeling unsafe. It could also be a lack of opportunity, equality, justice, or respect. To stand in the gap is to put oneself in that void to provide to another with what is missing when it is needed most. And to use one's strengths, resources, endurance, and perseverance to provide a bridge to get over safely and whole across that gap. Let me say that again. To stand in the gap is to put oneself into that void intentionally, to provide to another person what is missing when it is needed most, and to use one's strengths, resources, endurance, and perseverance to provide a bridge to get over safely and whole across that gap. Throughout our history in America, there have always been members of our community who, when they have seen that gap, sometimes at risk of their own lives, they have stepped selflessly into and stood bravely in that gap. We honor those people on this day and throughout this month and every day. People like Dr. King, whose conscience and acts stood in the gap when our country's own conscience and will to act on injustices had failed it. People like Medgar Evers, who stood in the gap in 1954 when he tested the Brown v. Board of Education ruling by applying to Ole Miss Law School. He didn't get in. He didn't get in, but he stood in that gap. And by standing there bravely and boldly, undisputably a man of intelligence and character, he resisted the myth that somehow we did not belong in our state's chief law school or anywhere else academically. 8 years later, in 1962, James Meredith stood in that gap when he made the courageous decision to enroll in Ole Miss, becoming the first black student admitted there. He not only stood in the gap, he pushed through it at great risk to his own life. It is important to note that James Meredith entered the University of Mississippi 8 years after the Brown decision by the Supreme Court. And it took an additional 8 years before all Mississippi's public school districts were finally officially desegregated in 1970. The mere existence of those two 8-year gaps between those milestones demonstrates the truth in Dr. King's position. When he was warned that he should be more patient, he responded that justice and equality only come slowly, even when people are fighting to fill those gaps. So someone saying be patient is the same as saying never. Our brave women have also stood bravely in that gap. We remember and honor Fannie Lou Hamer, who grew up right down the road in Ruleville. She stepped into that gap when she went to Atlantic City, New Jersey, to the Democratic National Convention in August of 1964. She revealed to the world the torture and abuse she and other black Mississippians experienced simply for trying to register to vote. She continued to resist the forces allied against our people that day, even when President Lyndon Johnson called a nationally televised press conference in the middle of her speech just so he could drown out her voice. But despite the immense power President Johnson wielded against her cause, 4 years later, Fannie Lou Hamer's vision became reality when she became a member of Mississippi's first integrated delegation to the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. We also remember that those gaps our leaders stood in were not all safe places. Not at all. In 1963, just 1 year after James Meredith entered Ole Miss, Medgar Evers was gunned down in his driveway in front of his family. James Meredith nearly paid with his life, as he was shot and wounded during his march against fear not very far from this campus in 1966. Fannie Lou Hamer was shot at, brutally beaten by police, and had her dignity as a woman assaulted. And of course, Dr. King was martyred by a cowardly sniper in 1968. We commemorate in this Black History Month those leaders, male and female, whose resistance was standing in the gap during the height of the Civil Rights Movement. They did so much to make our country a fairer and more just nation, one in which the phrase all men and women are created equal and endowed with certain inalienable rights could, after nearly 200 years, finally be mostly true. Mostly true. And justice might indeed roll down like water, and righteousness like a mighty stream. But let us not forget that while some names dominate our history books, movies, and documentaries, it is not only the most famous who make and shape our history. There are elders in our community, some of them sitting right here in this venue, who stood in the gaps in their own towns, in their own neighborhoods, their own schools, even when it was not safe for them to do so. There are among us today, and among families and communities of students here, brave men and women whose names are not trumpeted in our history books, who walked along with Dr. King and James Meredith and John Lewis, and who aided Fannie Lou Hamer in registering voters at the risk of their own safety. Their stories may not have made the books, but those stories form part of the solemn pride shared by their families and communities. We must remember and honor them too. In addition to standing in the gap, another way we have always resisted is by using the simplest possible word of resistance. no. No. We don't like to say no to people when they ask us to do something. Parents get upset when their 3-year-old tells them no. I got 2 babies at home, so I'm speaking from experience. We can get so disappointed when someone says no when we ask them to help us in some way. But sometimes those 2 letters are so powerful. Powerful for good. I call that the righteous no. In doing so, in inserting that no, a negative word can lead to positive change if used righteously. Now I'm following the lead of Dr. King here. In Birmingham in 1963, some white people whom Dr. King thought were his allies accused him of creating tension by leading nonviolent resistance in the form of marches and sit-ins. Dr. King replied, "I am not afraid of the word tension. I have earnestly worked and preached against violent tension, but there is a type of constructive, nonviolent tension that is necessary for growth." He said, "I am not afraid of the word tension. I have earnestly worked and preached against violent tension, but there is a type of constructive, nonviolent tension that is necessary for growth." Necessary. So while no is a negative and is not a violent negative, it is not a violent negative. It is simply a declaration that one will not cooperate with an oppressive and unjust system and will resist the demands and constraints that it places on one's mind, body, and spirit. Think of this. For so much of American history, saying no could be very dangerous for black people. We all know that. What would have happened to a slave if they had said, "No, I ain't gonna work today"? What if, when a slave owner came around to visit his female property, like President Thomas Jefferson, who wrote that little bit about all men being created equal? What would have happened if someone like Sally Hemings would have said no? What would have happened? What would have happened if a parent had told a white landowner, even up into the 1960s, "No, my child is not going to work in the fields, they are going to go to school"? What would have happened? Now, if you're young enough not to know about that last one, please ask your parents and grandparents. Because if they grew up in the South, they know exactly what I'm talking about. Exactly. Simply saying no has been a huge part of our history of resistance and has brought us real change. In the 1860s, the Union Army marched through the South, and so many black men said, "No, I ain't gonna work for free in your fields anymore. And as a matter of fact, I'm gonna pick up a rifle and make sure none of my people have to work in your fields anymore." When white moderates and pastors counseled Dr. King to go more slowly to avoid tension, Dr. King's response from a cell in a jail in Birmingham was a polite but powerfully reasoned and entirely firm no. You need a Blackwell, a very brave black woman who stood in the gap for so many people right near where I was born, also changed things by saying no. And not just once. The first time came when, in 1964, she went down to Issaquah County Courthouse to register to vote. A bunch of white farmers, when they found out what she and her friends were up to, tried to intimidate her and run them off. You need to simply refuse to leave. Now, in those days, they made us take a test in order to register to vote. It took Miss Blackwell 3 times to pass that test. And I'm sure after each of the first 2 tries, they figured she'd go home and leave them alone. But she just said, no, I'll be right back. She said, no, I'll be right back. And she persevered until they couldn't deny her anymore. And when she succeeded, she helped many more follow her. She stood in that gap. She also said no when the Issaquah County School District suspended 300 students from school. It don't take much to guess which 300 students were suspended. No, we know. What was their offense? Wearing a pin with the logo of the Student Nonviolent Coordinator Committee, SNCC, who were leading the effort to register voters. What was so offensive about it? What was so offensive about wearing a pin? A little button. Well, it included those 4 letters, SNCC. And the biggest scandal was an image of a black hand and a white hand clasped in solidarity. In those days, saying or wearing those 4 letters offended some people. And they tried to discredit the whole movement by saying they were communist-led organizations. Doesn't that sound like something we're still dealing with today regarding a certain 3 letters? Ms. Blackwell lost that battle. A court said that the school had the right to suspend those 300 students. She lost the battle, but she won the war. She lost the battle, but she won the war. Because the court also said that the school district had to integrate, as the Supreme Court had ordered over a decade earlier. She stood in that gap. And as most of you already know, she eventually became the first black female mayor in the state of Mississippi. Talk about poetic justice. Talk about it. You tell me God won't work. Tell me he won't work when you think he ain't right behind you, standing right beside you. It don't matter if you can't see him. He's right there. They can make you take a test and force you to fail it over and over again. But he's standing in that gap with you. All you got to do is take that next step forward like Miss Blackwell did. Finally, you all know who said the biggest and most righteous no of all. None other than Miss Rosa Parks. You know it. In fact, while we all know the story, many people don't know the full story. Ms. Parks was actually not sitting in a designated white seat. When she boarded that bus, she sat in the first row of the black seats. It was raining. And eventually, so many folks climbed onto the bus that all the white seats were filled up. And some white people were left standing. So the bus driver came back, moved the sign for the start of the black section behind where Rosa was sitting, which was also full. And he told her not only that she had to move, but she had to stand up so a white person could sit. Ms. Parks looked at that and thought about all she'd been through. Plus, she was tired. I'm working all day. Hey, you know about being tired and working and working and working, and it seems like you ain't getting nowhere. All of us have seen our grandparents and our parents working here in the Delta, trying to make life better for us, to give us just a little bit better living than they had. And it seemed like they're not getting anywhere. Here in the Delta, we know the seasons. We know the equipment. We know the crops. We know the land. We know the dirt. We know the dirt here in the Delta. My granddad used to come outside sometimes and walk on his front porch in the morning, 6 o'clock, with a cup of coffee. Take a breath of air. Smell the air. He can tell you that it's going to rain at 3 o'clock in the evening. You know it. You know it. That's how much we know this place. But with regard to Miss Parks, I'm sure that in her head, no disrespect intended to Miss Parks, but what she really said to herself was more like, hell no, I am not moving. No. It pretty much blew the bus driver's mind. And the police who came to arrest her, that this 42-year-old black woman, had the strength, through that 2-letter word, to stand up to them, their entire worldview, and the whole system that had been put in place to make sure white people never had to hear no from a black person. It may have been the greatest and most impactful no ever uttered. Ever. That is when no really began to show its potential as an agent for positive change, a creative force for good. Because when Ms. Parks said no, that meant that anyone could at any time and anywhere resist simply by refusing to comply with, submit to an oppressive system. Even a mature, dignified black woman on a bus. If that was the case, what would rise to fill the void she had created with those 2 letters? What followed would shape much of the tactics, goals, determination, and philosophy of the civil rights movement afterwards, and demonstrated that nonviolent resistance could be a very effective weapon and was the moral high ground. Our forebears have done us a great lasting service through their endurance and perseverance, and for their love of their people and their fellow man. They have made straight paths for us. They have done their best to fill in every valley and make low every mountain and hill for us. Our crooked roads are straighter, and our rough ways are far smoother than theirs ever were. But we still today need people to stand in those gaps. Young people like you. Remember those glasses I mentioned? That the ones Sensei Duckworth always knocked off my face? My family didn't buy those glasses for me. They didn't. They couldn't afford them. It was one of my teachers who got them for me in the 4th grade. She noticed I was struggling to see in class and realized that it was because I couldn't see the board. She told me to get up, come sit next to her desk where I could see better. And then later she took me to the doctor's office across town and got me that pair of big old brown glasses. They were heavy. Oh my goodness. But she did that without even asking my parents' permission. They didn't even know. My mom just saw me with a pair of glasses on. I remember the day. Where did you get those glasses from? I don't know, but I can see you. The teacher knew where I came from. She didn't want to embarrass my parents by asking them. Like so many people in our community, she just stepped up into that gap automatically when she saw what needed to be done, with no fuss and without having to be asked. Right now, there are kids in the Mississippi Delta, back home in your community, who are going to need someone, you, to stand in some of those gaps they face. Their parents may be doing the very best they can, but there's something you can do as a teacher, as a coach, to stand in those gaps. Practically every one of you can tell a story where someone you looked up to stood in the gap you may have had. Our people need jobs, worthwhile careers, right here in the Delta and back home in your community. Many of you young people in here today are planning to be entrepreneurs. Maybe you're thinking about how you can set up a business in Atlanta or Memphis or somewhere else. And while those places have their attractions, you won't find a more affordable place to set up a business than right here in the Mississippi Delta. Right here in the Mississippi Delta. Land, housing, and commercial spaces, they're all cheaper right now, right here in the Delta. If you come from a smaller town outside the Delta, you might find it a better fit than a big city when you look at the big picture. And you won't find harder working folks who are more eager to show just how capable and motivated they are than within our own communities. Standing in the gap for our own people. And I know this because I've met them. Some of them are sitting right here. About a year and a half ago, 8 black men walked into my office, right over here in Indianola, Mississippi. 8 of them walked into my office. They were farm workers. The youngest was maybe 40 years old. A couple of guys were in their early 50s. Somebody in their 60s. 2 or 3 of them were in their 70s. One of them had been working on the farm since he was 8 years old. 8 years old. And was stood in that office because they had found out that they had been getting cheated out of their pay. They had been getting cheated out of their pay. And what broke my heart that day, what broke my heart was, as a lawyer, you have to get people to sign documentation before we can represent them. So I slid out 8 pieces of paper. They started signing. But one gentleman wasn't doing anything. He wasn't signing his paper. One of the oldest ones there, the one that had started working there when he was 8 years old. And I said, "Sir, can I help you?" I said, "We need you to sign right here." I said, "Can you sign it right here?" He said, "I think I can try." And I said, "Let me read it to you." And I read the paper to him. And then in reading it to him, I knew why he couldn't sign it. 1, he couldn't read. 2, he couldn't write. He was 78 years old. So for 70 years, you've been working for somebody. For 70 years, you've been working for somebody who's been cheating you out of your livelihood. That made me so mad. So mad. But, what made me proud, I saw that black resistance that day. Because all 8 of those men risked everything to walk in my office that day. They risked it all. And we won their case. We won. They won. They won. But guess who else won? Weeks after we won their case, black farm workers all over the Delta started getting raises to where they were supposed to be getting paid. That's black resistance, and that's that no. They said no that day. They said no. Some of those men look like my grandfather. Some of them look like my father. Some of them remind me of my uncles. Some of them look like me. I grew up chopping cotton right here in the Delta. Right here in the Delta. One more thing we need you all to get involved in is the political process, young people. You have to get involved in the political process. Have to. It is essential. I'm looking at you. It is essential that you get involved in the political process. I know a lot of you already are, but it is essential. Our elders will tell you just how important it is that you vote. And you know exactly what they went through in order to win that right for us. We're here today to commemorate it. Not only that, you've seen what happened in Georgia because young people, just like you, got involved in the process and went to the polls and made sure your voices got heard. And man, they made it heard. So much so now that powers would like to keep your voices silent because they fear your power. They fear your power, young people. They fear you coming to the polls. They fear you registering to vote the moment you graduate high school. They fear you registering people to vote on your campus. They fear that. Use that power. What do y'all like to say? Flex it? Flex that power. Flex on them. I'm telling you. Flex. Your vote. Young people, your vote is the most powerful currency you have. It's more powerful than a check at the end of the month. It's more powerful than the extra dollars you might get from here or there. That vote that you have, exercising that, flexing that, it moves mountains. And this is how interesting it is. And this is how powerful it is. Georgia, the state of Georgia, on the backs of young people, just elected its first ever black senator to the United States Senate. First ever black man, twice to the United States, first ever. Now we've had two black senators in this state. Hiram Rose Revels and Blanche Bruce. Now, the interesting thing about them is that they weren't elected by all of us. They were elected by the legislative body. Right? But listen to this statistic. The state of Mississippi has the highest percentage of black people in any state in this country. In any state in this country. That includes Georgia. Love Georgia to death. Love peaches. But the state of Mississippi has the highest percentage of black people in this country. And I'm telling you where that power lies at. In you, young people. Y'all got it. And they are terrified that you're about to wake up and use it. Trust me when I tell you that. Trust me. I spent years in Washington, D.C. I've sat with some of the most powerful leaders in our state. They are terrified that you are going to register to vote. Because when you vote, you don't just sit at the table. You flip the table over. I'm telling you. So, folks, today, they say sometimes you don't care about politics, but both parties are just the same anyway. And you can't make a difference. Young people, yes you can. Yes you can. Absolutely. American society, Mississippi, and let's be honest, some white folks who have been in both of them for most of our history have been good at telling us no. They've been really good at it. It's powerful. When our ancestors asked us, can we be free? They said no. When we asked, can we vote? They said no. When we asked, can we run for office and run things ourselves? They answered no. When we asked, can our kids go to school with white kids or at least have schools as good as those kids, they said no. But a few years ago, in 2008, I watched somebody say yes. I flew in a helicopter with somebody that said yes. I traveled around the world with somebody that said yes. Yes, we can. And I heard it loud and clear. That yes, that powerful yes that came from Rosa Parks sitting there and saying no. That's where the yes came from. She made it. And Dr. King made it when he said no from Birmingham jail. when you need a black brother, right out here in Queen County said no, she was really telling us today, yes. When Fannie Lou Hamer right over here in Rubeville, Mississippi, decided to go to the Democratic National Convention and say no, she was whispering to us in the future, say yes. That's what she was saying. And I'm telling you today, I believe in you. Standing here today, listening to your voices, that is powerful. That is powerful. So when they tell us to stop protesting, stop taking the knee, we're going to say no. Because somebody from my history told me yes. And finally, when our society says you can't have that job, you can't finance that house, you can't open that business, you can't be the president of the United States because you're not good enough, we're going to stand in that gap. And we're going to say no. Because that's power. Thank you. I love you all. Keep resisting.